Hello everyone, this is Serious Trivia, and today we're going to talk about unit stats in Total War Warhammer 3. And to help us out, we'll be mainly using the Jade Warrior Crossbowmen here with Shield, as they have every stat you can expect in Total War Warhammer 3, going from melee stats to range stats to even having a shield. And also helping us out for things they don't have, we have the Jade Warriors in the background, meleeing for some of the magic, and a single entity in the Terracotta Sentinel to show us some of the single entity stats. But back to our Jade Warrior Crossbowmen, we'll start with the first stat on the card, which is actually hit points, which is something most people tend to ignore because it's so easy to understand. This is how much health you have. But what most people don't recognize here is this is the health of all the entities in a unit. So for example, we have 90 units here per retinue or per unit of Jade Warrior Crossbowmen. And for each model here, they have their own individual health. If you divide these numbers, 90 into 6,210, you discover that they have 69 health each. The number 69 is used quite often in the design of Grand Cathay. They have 69 total tech, because 69 is the harmony symbol of yin-yang when you write it down. And that's repeated here for Jade Warriors, who look like they have a lot more health with 8,280. But if you divide that by 120, each of these models also have 69 health. So sometime when you're thinking about which unit have more health, they're actually the same. And that's going to matter when you take spell damage. For example, Meleeing has a vortex spell called Talons of the Night. Now the first thing you need to notice when considering spell damage is whether they are armor-piercing or not. And that's by the percentage next to the damage figure. In our case, it's 100% armor-piercing. That's what that little symbol means. Which means we can ignore armor. We'll come back to this a bit later when we talk about armor. So we can read this as we will dish out 5 damage over the course of 11 seconds, or 5 damage per second. So in total, we'll dish out 55 damage on everything that stands on top of the spell for the full 11 seconds. So big guy here, single entity, 12,620 health, will take 55 damage. Each of these units here, each model that's standing on top of the spell for the full duration, will take 55 damage. If their total health is only 69 damage, 55 damage is a huge chunk of their health, and this entire unit will get chunked down. So that's things you have to consider about health. And that also means we could have a unit here that end up only having, say, 90 health, but each individual model is still alive, because somehow we have a spell damage that's amplified, and we do exactly 68 damage over the course of the spell, and we cast it over these guys. Each model here will have 1 health left, and they will still be super effective for your army because these are range units. Each of those models can still shoot their ammo and apply range damage. So those are all things you can consider. And when you are healing, you need to have the entity alive to receive the healing. So in our extreme case of having only 90 health, where each model has 1 health left, Meleeing can use her healing spell and actually heal the unit back. But if we have 90 health and only, 69 health and only 1 entity left, as in everyone else died, and this guy somehow is full health because he's super lucky and didn't stand in a spell, we can't heal this unit back. Even though it's missing 89 out of 90th of its health, because the only entity that's alive is 100% healthy, any healing spell on it is useless. Single entity, on the other hand, can be healed back to full, because as long as the big guy's not dead, he can receive healing, up to 60% of his total health. There is a replenishment cap per battle. So the more health you have, actually the more benefit you can get from healing spells. So this is a case that we talked about before when leveling up Meleeing for her skill tree. Percentage health worked quite well on her because she is a very good healer and one of the few healing lords in the game right now. So percentage health on her actually works in her favor more than most. And that's pretty much everything we need to know about hit points, as we can move on to a very minor stat called mass. So mass doesn't really do much with damage. It has to do with collision and knockback. In our case, each of our model has 100 mass. This big guy here has 6,500 mass. So what happens when they collide? The little guy goes flying. It's a weight for physics. That's all you need to know about that. And if you have a big guy with a lot of mass moving through a unit with very little mass, they can't stop the unit. So if I want to walk past these guys to reach the guys behind, they're helpless. I'll just charge right through them. If the mass is close, we can sort of weigh them down. Because you can think of the mass as individual mass. So this guy's 100, this guy's 100, this guy's 100, this guy's 100. If I have someone that's only 700 mass trying to move through this group, maybe these 8 guys here, I actually have more mass than him. So that's why oftentimes light cavalries can't get a clean charge through. On paper, you're saying he's 100, I'm 700, I should get a clean charge through. That's not the case. This guy is thick. There's 4 100 in this row, and if you collide with the multiple one of them, they have more combined weight than you, and you can't get a clean charge through. But if the difference is so big, where the guy is 6,500, and if you multiply everyone together, yeah, you are 9,000, but he isn't going to hit all of you guys on the collision course and not knock you guys back. So that's all things you have to consider with mass. Now we're moving to the actual stats on the stat card, starting with armor. So here it says we have 80 armor, he has 100, and he has 80, and we have 70. What does that all mean? Well, armor protects you from base damage. Base damage can come in the form of weapon strength on melee attack, missile strength on missile attack, or magic, as we have seen here. 100% armor piercing, so this one will ignore all armor. But if you don't have 100% armor piercing, it will say 0%, 33%, 50%. Then the remaining percentage is base damage. And base damage, even in the form of spell, can be blocked by armor. So having a high armor protects you from base damage. How much protection will you get? Well, it depends a bit on luck, because the game will roll a random number between 3 choices, 0.5, 0.75, and 1, to determine how effective your armor is per hit. So every single hit your model takes will roll this random number from 0.5, 0.75, and 1. So on average, you can expect 0.75. But let's say we roll 1 here. Then 80 times 1, 80. We can protect ourselves from 80% of the enemy base damage. So if we're getting hit by this big guy here, if we can click on him and not pass through another unit, there we go. And we're getting hit for 150 base damage here. 80% of that will be taken out. So we're only going to get hit by 30 base damage. But what if this big guy here rolls 1 and we have 100% armor? Are we protected from all the base damage? Sort of. So if we have 2 Terracotta Sentinel bashing into each other and we got lucky and we rolled 1, we got 100% protection, we'll get hit by 450 armor piercing plus 1 point. There's always a minimum of 1 point of base damage that will go through no matter what armor value you roll. So just be mindful of that. You'll always be able to hit 1 point of your base damage on every clean hit. Now, if you roll 0.5, that means your 100 armor suddenly becomes only 50, and only 50% of the base damage will be protected. So if you are thinking, what if I have 200 armor? Then no matter what, I will have 100%. That's true. On average, you expect 0.75. That's why certain heavily armored units like Celestial Dragon Guards, I think, have 130 armor. So in that case, like 0.75 is close to 100%. So on average, you're pretty much protected from base damage. But you'll still get those times where you get hit with the 0.5 and you'll take some damage. Now, in addition to that, this unit here has a little shield icon. Well, this is applicable to range attack. So if we're getting hit by another range unit, there is a base component and an armor piercing component, and the damage factor works just the same for the armor side, but for those hits, each hit will have a chance to be dodged. And there's 35% chance for this particular shield that they have. There are different types of shield in the game. For example, the ogres have their Iron Fist, which is considered a shield, and that's only 20% effective. And it's always only effective from the front. And there's going to be Chaos Warriors with 50% shields. So usually they look bigger, but design and actual numbers don't always match up. So take a look before you decide how to approach certain fights. And that's pretty much how the shield work. Now, one thing we have to know about missile fire is the missile actually have to hit your unit. So if we're targeting with our crossbows at, say, Miao Ying, she's a single entity, she's quite small, and she jukes, and half of the arrows hit the ground. It's not just the point and click, those damage go through, 35 doesn't. It's whatever bolt actually hits her, then 35% of those bolts will bounce off. Assuming she has a shield, she does not, but use that logic when you're thinking about missile fire. If you juke all the missiles and they hit the ground, nothing hits. But if you don't juke and you take the hit and the model actually get hit with the arrow, then a certain percentage of that will be bounced off because you have a shield, and the rest will go through, applying however much armor you have for that particular roll of the damage, 0.5, 0.75, and 1. Then moving on, we have leadership. This is your willingness to fight. And this number can vary quite a bit. Big guy here is unbreakable, so you'll always stay at 100 no matter what. And there's tons of buffs and debuffs. If you're near a lord, you have +3 points from like encourage. Once you start the fight, we're currently in deployment, so you don't see those values. And in essence, if this number ever falls close to 0, you start losing the will to fight. You often saw those little white banners. Your troops are running, they're routing off the field. Sometimes they can recover as they route away from factors that's decreasing their leadership. Maybe you just got hit with a hex, a spell that decreases leadership for 20 seconds. It goes away, your unit bounce back, come back to fight for you again. There's also times when you're under missile fire, you're flanked, you're getting hit by cavalry, and once you start routing off the field, those factors are removed, or perhaps you're running towards a capture point, or you're running towards a lord, and they help boost your leadership a little bit, and you bounce back. There are those opportunities. For unbreakable unit, this just means they will fight to the death. They will never rout off the field. They only leave when they die. So that's leadership, very simple. Speed is also very simple. So this is how fast you move on the battlefield. This can change due to a few factors. Namely, you can get buffed by spells, but that's pretty easy to understand. When you are charging at a target, meaning when you right-click a target and you start building up speed towards them, there is a charging speed bonus applied to a unit. So 2 units of the same speed, if you're running away from them and they are charging at you, they will catch up to you slowly. Another factor that will affect speed is fatigue. Fatigue will actually affect speed, melee attack, melee defense. So basically across the board, it's going to affect your unit leadership as well. As you get tired on the battlefield, these core stats will drop, and that's why vigor recovery spells and vigor recovery in general, or vigor resistance, are quite key. You will always end up seeing, you might even see a unit that's fatigue immune in the game, which I think is, there's vigor resistant in the skill of certain units, and I think there's also vigor immunity in Warhammer, although I don't remember any of the launch faction having any, but that's something to consider. Now, aside from speed, we move on to melee attack and melee defense. These are sort of the most confusing and core stats for most new players, especially some of my audience who's coming from Three Kingdoms, where we didn't have melee attack and melee defense. We simply had evasion. And evasion was a little bit easier to understand because, you know, it makes sense. That's how much we dodge, and enemies always can hit us. But that's not the case in Warhammer, and even say in Troy, which uses the same engine, which is why we have the same numbers. We can look at these separately, even though they sound kind of similar. If we look at melee attack, it's how likely we are to hit an enemy, and the game uses this equation: melee attack plus a base percentage of 35, subtract the enemy melee defense. So for example, if I was using this unit as a melee unit to attack this unit, then what will happen is I will take 16, I'll add 35 to it, we're at 51, and then we subtract this unit's melee defense, which is 34, and we end up with 17. That means we have a 17% chance per hit to hit that unit. If we don't hit them, none of the damage goes through. And that's why high melee defense is very useful. So let's talk about a couple of extreme cases. What if our melee attack is so high that once we get 35 points bonus and we subtract their melee defense, we get over 100%. Do we hit every time? Well, no. The game uses a range. And the ceiling of hit chance range is 90%. No matter how high you go over that, each hit only has a maximum of 90% chance of hitting. And that goes the same for your melee defense. So in our case, we have 24, means someone else is trying to hit us. They get the 35% bonus, subtract our 24. What if our melee defense is just so high that they can't hit us? The negative number shows up or 0 shows up. Do we dodge all attacks? No, because just like there's a 90% ceiling, there's an 8% floor. So no matter how high your melee defense becomes, enemy units always have an 8% chance of hitting you. And both of these figures are for melee figures. So they're useless for missile damage and useless for magic damage. Those will ignore melee defense and melee attack. But for melee damage, both of these stats are very core and very important to the game. Then moving on, we have weapon strength. This is pretty easy to explain. We have two components to our melee weapon, a base damage, or armor-piercing damage, and if you're special, you might have a bonus damage. In this case, we have a bonus against large on these Jade Warriors. And how this works is your base damage, if you get a hit by your melee attack versus the enemy melee defense, you will roll the armor value on the enemy, and let's say we rolled 50%, right? So ended up being 40% protection. Then the 8 damage here, 40% of it will be gone. And we're left with 4.8 damage that goes through. Armor-piercing damage always goes through. Bonus against large is split in the same ratio as your base and armor-piercing ratio. So in this case, for this unit in particular, the ratio is 2 to 5, right? So you'll split base damage bonus of the large. So 16 doesn't divide out too evenly, but you get roughly around 4 points added to the base, and the remaining 12 points get added to the armor piercing. And then you do your same math calculation on the enemy armor, whether you hit or not using the enemy melee defense in your melee attack, and that's the damage you dish out on the enemy. Of course, these numbers look very small because that's for each of these entities, right? They're all attacking. Big single entities have huge inflated numbers because there's only one of them, right? He's dishing out 600. You have 120 guys, technically possible, dishing out 28, right? So it still matches up fairly well. Of course, not all of them will be engaged in combat at the same time, and there's going to be a lot of variations to the number depending on how you set up your formation, how wide you spread your troops out, how they make contact, and so forth. And if you're surrounding on a single entity, there's no way all of them can whack the small Mei Ying at the same time. Maybe 3-4 guys surrounding her can hit her. So things will be different depending on what your target is. And that's pretty much everything we can know about the melee side of things. The only thing you might need to know is there are resistances in the game. And in particular, there are things called magical attack. There are things called poison attack, fire attack, charm attack. And usually they describe it pretty, easy to understand. If enemy unit have a stat called physical resistance, usually in the trait, for demon unit, it's pretty common, maybe 20% physical resistance. Anything that's not a magic attack is a physical attack, and they will block 20% of that damage, whatever damage they take, right? So if they dodged it, don't even worry about it. If they're getting hit, their armor will still be applied, and whatever actual damage goes through, take another 20% off of that. Damage resistance, right? Physical damage resistance. And there's also spell damage resistance, which protect you from magical damage. In this case, we have magical damage. Terra Coalition don't have magical damage. They ignore physical resistance, but they're blocked by spell resistance. And as well as spells, right? Common sense. And then on top of that, there's something called ward save, and ward save protects you from all types of damage. So that's just straight up damage resistance. And you can have a combination of these different type of resistances to each type of damage. It could go crazy. And then things like poison just gives you an additional debuff once you hit them. So nothing too fancy there. Flaming attack gives you a debuff against regeneration. So those are all pretty easy to understand. Now let's move on to the range component. There's only 3 stats: ammo, range, and missile strength. Ammo and range, very easy to understand. How many shots we have before we run out, how far we can shoot. This number can change a bit depending on your elevation. So let's say you're standing high ground, then your indicator is only going to show you 160, but you can shoot actually a little bit farther. If you're on the low ground and you're shooting up a hill, your indicator will still show 160, but you can't hit the edge. Your unit range is actually shorter. Physics apply in the game. And if you know about the manual fire trick with insert on things like sky junk, which floats in the air, so they're automatically elevated, and you can tilt up with the insert shooting mode, you can actually shoot way farther than your range. I think for a sky junk, you can shoot across the entire map if you want, using the insert mode. So physics does play a role, but basically it tells you how far your unit shoots, assuming it's just flat ground, same elevation, then this number is fairly accurate. And then finally, the more confusing stat is this missile strength. So on paper, the number here is almost meaningless. What you want to look at is actually the base and armor-piercing value, just like weapon strength. In our case, each of our crossbows will hurt 18 base and 6 armor-piercing per bolt that's hit. And there's a reload time, 11.7 seconds. But you can see here, the total missile strength is not just the addition of the two figures like in weapon strength. They take into consideration of how long a reload, and they sort of average you out over 10 seconds. Now this average doesn't really mean anything in real combat, because let's say it's real combat, well, if you're starting fresh, you shoot a missile, you do 24 damage at the 10-second mark, and then the next 10-second, it's where, you know, your average out over a long period of time comes down to 21 damage per 10 seconds. But I don't think this number actually provide much game knowledge aside from comparing two units using a relatively similar standard when reload time is a huge factor. What you really care about is actually how much damage am I doing, right? So in this case, 18 and 6. And that's pretty much everything you know on the unit stat card. Ability is a whole nother game, and there are a ton of them, so we're not going to touch that this time. We're mainly just trying to explain how the game works in the background in terms of how you should value melee attack, melee defense, armor, percentage increase on weapon strength. This is particularly helpful for trying to level up lords. At the end here, I realized I did forget to mention charge bonus, which is almost a useless stat in Warhammer, which is maybe why we forgot. But in essence, how charge bonus work is when you're charging a unit at an enemy unit. First off, what is a charge? Well, if the two units already fighting next to each other and you just right click on the unit, that's not a charge because you don't have time to build up some speed towards the unit. But let's say even at this distance, right, there's a significant gap here. That's considered significant enough. And I click on this unit and I right click here and they charge into them. That's a charge, even if the distance is short. You just can't be, gelled into each other. And when you're charging like this, you get a 7-second bonus of decaying buff. And the charge bonus will be buffed to your melee attack and your weapon strength. So this 8 points will be added to your melee attack and weapon strength. Weapon strength in the same ratio as your base and armor piercing again. And it will decay over 7 seconds. So it's not going to last very long. Provides a little boost of shock damage, which is why it's kind of useless in Warhammer because most units have very pitifully low charge bonus. If we come from Three Kingdoms where we have numbers of over 500, you know what I mean by being useless. But you still find a couple units with decent charge bonus in the game. Sinesh in general has, I guess, closer to 100, and that's slightly more respectable. I mean, even the big guy here only has 25, so it's not a terribly useful stat in Warhammer. So hopefully this explains everything, and we'll come back in the future for more guides. I know a lot of people have been requesting about magic, and we'll get to it. But first, we're going to clear up everything on these unit stat cards, as I felt things might get repetitive for my character skill tree guide if I keep having to explain which stats I value. For example, for Malian's guide, I mentioned, melee defense is just infinitely better than armor because you are evading an entire attack, both the base damage and the armor piercing damage component, when armor stat, will only block the base damage component and only affect the hits that actually hit you. So those are different factors we consider, and now hopefully they're all clear to you. And that's going to do it for our guide here, and I'll see you all next time. Bye!